I've worked the graveyard shift at the Meridian Plaza for 3 years now, and honestly, the solitude is usually the best part of the job. It's a massive, 30-story glass monolith that overlooks the city, but at 3 in the morning, it feels more like a hollowed-out ribcage of a giant beast. My routine is rhythmic, almost meditative, starting on the top floor and working my way down through the executive suites, where the air always smells faintly of expensive mahogany and stale espresso. Tonight started just like any other Tuesday, with the heavy jingle of my keys echoing against the marble tiles of the lobby as I clocked in. I like the way the fluorescent lights hum in the silence, a low-frequency buzz that fills the void left by the absence of 300 white-collar workers. There's a specific kind of stillness that settles into a building when it's empty, a pressurized quiet that makes every footstep sound like a gunshot. I took the service elevator up to the 22nd floor, which is occupied by a mid-sized venture capital firm with a penchant for plush, charcoal gray carpeting. I remember checking the security log at the desk. It showed that the last employee, a guy named Marcus who always leaves a half-eaten bagel in his trash, had swiped out at 8:45 p.m. According to the system, I was the only soul on this entire level, and likely the only person in the building besides the sleepy guard at the front desk 20 floors below. I started by emptying the bins, the plastic liners crinkling loudly in the stagnant air. It's a mindless task, one that lets my thoughts drift to anything from my grocery list to the weird dreams I've been having lately. The 22nd floor is a maze of cubicles and glass-walled corner offices, all of them dark except for the occasional glowing monitor left on sleep mode. I finished the trash around 1:15 a.m. and went back to my cart to pull out the heavy-duty industrial vacuum. This vacuum is a beast, a loud, vibrating monster that requires me to wear noise-canceling headphones if I don't want my ears ringing for the rest of the night. I slipped the cushions over my ears, feeling that sudden, pressurized drop in volume as the world outside turned into a muffled, underwater blur. I clicked the power switch with my foot, and the motor roared to life, a comforting mechanical growl that usually helps me tune out the inherent creepiness of a dark office. I began with the long hallway that connects the break room to the main workspace, pushing the nozzle back and forth in perfect, overlapping lines. I pride myself on those lines. There's something deeply satisfying about seeing the pile of the carpet lifted and smoothed into a uniform texture. About halfway down the hall, I noticed a small, dark spot near the baseboard of the server room door. I stopped for a second, frowning, and nudged it with the toe of my work boot, thinking it might be a coffee spill I'd missed. It was thick, almost like wet clay, and it didn't smear easily, which was strange given that nobody had been here for 5 hours. I shrugged it off, assuming Marcus or one of his colleagues had tracked in some mud from the rainy parking lot earlier that evening. I spent an extra minute scrubbing at it with a damp rag until the carpet looked pristine again. I went back to my vacuuming, the vibrations traveling up my arms and into my chest, a steady rhythm that usually lulls me into a trance-like state. I moved into the main cubicle farm, the big open space where the shadows seemed to stretch out from under the desks like long, black fingers. As I worked my way toward the back of the floor, I had that nagging sensation of being watched, that prickle on the back of my neck that I usually attribute to an overactive imagination. I turned around once or twice, sweeping my flashlight across the rows of empty chairs, but everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. The headphones make me feel vulnerable, so I usually keep my back to a wall, but in the open floor plan, that's almost impossible. I reached the far end of the cubicles, near the floor-to-ceiling windows that look out over the darkened expressway. I paused to adjust the cord, and as I turned to pull more slack, I saw something that made my stomach do a slow, nauseating flip. Right there, in the middle of the perfectly manicured carpet lines I had just finished 5 minutes ago, was a single, wet footprint. It wasn't a smudge or a faint mark. It was a clear, heavy impression of a work boot, identical in size to mine but caked in thick, black muck. My heart skipped a beat and I stood perfectly still, my hand white-knuckling the vacuum handle while the motor continued to scream in my ears. I slowly rotated my head, looking back toward the hallway I just cleaned, and my breath hitched in my throat. There was another one, about 3 feet behind the first, and then another, leading all the way back into the shadows of the break room. It looked as if someone had been walking directly behind me, stepping into the path of the vacuum the moment I moved forward. I pulled one of my headphone cups off my ear. The sudden rush of the vacuum's roar and the building's ambient hum crashing into my brain. I listened, straining to hear anything over the mechanical drone. A footstep, a breath, the creak of a floorboard. But there was nothing. I switched the vacuum off, and the sudden silence was so heavy it felt like it was pressing against my eardrums. I stood there in the dark. The only light coming from the distant street lamps filtered through the tinted glass, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding thin and fragile in the vast, empty space. No one answered, and the silence seemed to mock me, stretching out into the dark corners of the office. I took a step toward the footprints, my flashlight trembling in my hand as I shone it directly on the most recent mark. The mud was still glistening, wet and fresh, and as I watched, a small bead of water squeezed out from the heel mark and soaked into the gray fibers. I realized then that the footprints weren't coming from the entrance. They were starting and ending right where I stood. I spun around, my light darting frantically over the desks, and that's when I saw the closet door near the printer station. It was a small maintenance closet, one I knew was usually locked because I kept my extra supplies in there. But now it was cracked open just an inch. I didn't see a face or a hand, but I saw the edge of a dark, heavy coat reflecting in the beam of my light. My pulse was racing so hard I could feel it in my teeth, and I backed away, my eyes locked on that sliver of darkness in the doorway. I reached for my radio to call the guard, but my belt was empty. I'd left it on the cleaning cart 30 yards away in the hallway. I felt a surge of pure, primal panic as I realized I was trapped at the far end of the floor, with the only exit blocked by whoever was in that closet. I looked back down at the floor, and my blood turned to ice. A new footprint had appeared, not behind me this time, but right in front of me, perfectly positioned between my feet. It was as if someone was standing directly in my personal space, chest to chest with me, invisible but for the weight they pressed into the floor. I didn't scream. I couldn't even draw enough air into my lungs to make a sound. I bolted, not toward the exit, but toward the corner office, slamming the heavy glass door behind me and fumbling with the lock until it clicked. I backed into the furthest corner of the room, pressing my spine against the cold window pane, my eyes fixed on the carpet outside the glass wall. Slowly, with agonizing deliberation, the muddy prints began to appear on the other side of the glass, one after the other, heading straight for the door. They stopped just inches from the threshold, the mud oozing out from under an invisible weight, staining the expensive carpet. I watched the door handle jiggle, once, twice, and then a heavy, wet thud hit the glass, like a body leaning its full weight against it. I'm sitting here now, the light from my phone screen the only thing keeping the darkness at bay, while I listen to the sound of something heavy dragging itself back and forth outside the door. I've tried calling the front desk, but the signal in this corner of the building is dead, and the landline on the desk requires a code I don't have. All I can do is wait for the sun to come up, or for the glass to finally give way under the pressure of whatever is standing out there in the dark. The worst part isn't the waiting. It's the fact that I can see the mud starting to seep under the crack of the door, slowly creeping across the floor toward my feet. I can hear a wet, rhythmic slapping sound now, like bare feet walking through a swamp, and it's getting closer to where I'm cowering. I don't think the lock is going to hold much longer, because the handle is turning with a slow, mechanical grinding sound. I can see a shadow blocking the light from the hallway, but when I shine my phone, there is no one there, just the mud. The mud is forming a perfect circle around the chair I'm sitting in, and I can smell the stench of stagnant pond water filling the small office. I've realized now why the security log was so quiet. Whoever this is didn't need to swipe in. They've been here the whole time, just waiting for the sound of the vacuum to mask their approach. The slapping sound has stopped right in front of me, and I can feel a cold, damp draft hitting my face as if someone is exhaling right into my eyes. My phone battery is at 3%, and the screen is flickering, threatening to leave me in total darkness with whatever is pressing against my knees. I'm going to close my eyes now because I can see the shape of a hand pressing into the air, just inches from my throat. There is no one coming to help me, and the sun won't rise for another 4 hours. I just hope that when they find me, they at least wonder where all this mud came from. The handle just snapped off the door, and the glass is starting to spiderweb under a force I can't see. I can feel the weight of a hand on my shoulder, heavy and cold as the grave. It's over, and the only sound left in the building is the hum of the fluorescent lights that I used to find so comforting. I should have never taken the night shift. I should have stayed in the light. Now there is only the mud and the dark. The fluorescent lights in the lobby of the St. Jude Hotel have a specific, high-pitched hum that you only really notice after 2:00 a.m. when the last of the late check-ins has finally shuffled off to their rooms. I've worked the graveyard shift here for 3 years now, and I've become intimately familiar with every groan and pop the old building makes as it settles into its foundations. The lobby is a cavern of polished marble and faded velvet, smelling faintly of lemon oil and the kind of heavy, recycled air that's been trapped in the vents since the late 90s. My shift is usually a blur of filing invoices, drinking lukewarm coffee from a styrofoam cup, and watching the security monitors flicker with gray, graining footage of empty hallways. The console on my desk is a chunky, beige relic of the past, filled with rows of plastic buttons that light up whenever a guest dials the front desk from their room. I remember the orientation back when I started, specifically the manager pointing to a dead spot on the panel where the button for room 412 should have been. He told me the room was permanently walled off during the 2014 renovations because of a structural instability that made it unsafe to occupy. If you walk down the 4th floor hallway today, you'll just see a continuous stretch of floral wallpaper where a door used to be, perfectly seamless and unremarkable. At exactly 3:12 a.m. last Tuesday, the silence of the lobby was broken by a sharp, mechanical chirping sound that I hadn't heard in months. I looked down at the console and felt a cold prickle of sweat break out across the back of my neck, because the light for room 412 was blinking a frantic, rhythmic red. I assumed it was a short circuit, or maybe some old wiring finally giving up the ghost after a decade of being buried behind drywall. I didn't pick up the first time, choosing instead to stare at the light until it eventually timed out and went dark again. 5 minutes later, it started again, this time with a persistence that felt almost aggressive in the empty lobby. I finally reached out and pressed the speakerphone button, expecting to hear nothing but the hiss of a dead line or the crackle of empty electricity. Instead, what came through the speaker was the sound of heavy, wet breathing that seemed to vibrate against the plastic casing of the desk unit. It wasn't the sound of a ghost or a spirit, but the very real, labored intake of air from someone who sounded like they were struggling to stay conscious. I whispered a tentative hello, my voice sounding thin and brittle in the vastness of the lobby, but there was no verbal response. I heard a frantic, sharp tapping, like someone was striking a hard object against a receiver, over and over again in a desperate code. I hung up the phone, my hand shaking so badly that I accidentally knocked my coffee cup over, spilling the brown liquid across the guest log. I told myself it was a prank, that maybe some kids had figured out how to patch into the old PBX system from a different room to mess with the night clerk. I decided to pull the old blueprints from the filing cabinet behind the desk to see if there was any maintenance access that could explain the call. According to the yellowed papers, room 412 wasn't just a small bedroom. It was an oversized corner suite that shared a wall with the main service elevator shaft. The blueprints showed that when they walled it off, they didn't actually gut the room or fill it with concrete. They just built a new interior wall across the doorway. This meant that for 10 years, there had been a fully furnished, airtight room sitting completely sealed off from the rest of the world. The thought of that dark, stagnant space made my stomach churn, especially when the phone began to ring for the third time. I picked it up immediately, and this time a voice finally broke through the static, sounding muffled as if speaking through layers of thick fabric. It was a man's voice, raspy and raw, whispering that he could see me through the cracks in the world. I told him this wasn't funny, and that I was going to call the police if he didn't stop harassing the front desk. The caller let out a low, bubbling laugh, and told me that the police couldn't find a door that didn't exist anymore. He started describing exactly what I was wearing, down to the stain on my tie, and the way I was clutching the edge of the marble desk. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, as I realized that he wasn't looking at me through a camera. The security monitors showed the lobby was empty, the front doors were locked, and there was no one standing in the shadows of the mezzanine. I grabbed the heavy master key ring and a flashlight, driven by a panicked need to prove to myself that the hallway was empty. I took the service elevator to the 4th floor, the metal cage rattling and clanking in a way that felt far more sinister than usual. When the doors slid open, the hallway was bathed in the sickly yellow glow of the recessed lighting, stretching out in a long, silent corridor. I walked slowly toward the spot where room 412 should have been, my shoes clicking loudly on the thin carpet. I reached the section of the wall between 410 and 414, and everything looked perfectly normal, just the same repeating pattern of gold lilies. I leaned my ear against the wallpaper, holding my breath until my lungs burned, listening for any sign of life from the other side. For a long minute, there was nothing, and I began to feel a wave of relief, thinking I had simply let my imagination run away with me. Then, from directly behind the drywall, only inches from my face, came a sharp, rhythmic knocking that matched the sound from the phone. I jumped back, my flashlight beam dancing wildly across the ceiling, as a muffled voice spoke from inside the wall. The voice sounded different now, clearer, and it wasn't asking for help. It was complaining about how cramped the space had become over the years. He said he had learned to move through the wall cavities, sliding between the studs and the insulation like a needle through fabric. I realized then that he wasn't trapped in room 412 at all. He had been using it as a base of operations to navigate the entire skeleton of the hotel. He whispered that the St. Jude was full of hollow spaces, gaps in the architecture where a thin man could live unnoticed if he was patient enough. I turned and ran back toward the elevator, my breath coming in jagged gasps as I heard the sound of something heavy dragging itself through the ceiling tiles above me. I scrambled back behind the front desk, fumbling for my cell phone to call the manager, but the lobby phone rang again before I could dial. I didn't want to answer it, but the light for the lobby's own extension was the one blinking this time. I looked up at the ceiling, noticing for the first time that one of the decorative vent grates directly above my head was slightly askew. A single drop of something dark and viscous hit the marble desk, followed by the sound of a soft, satisfied chuckle from the darkness of the ductwork. I realized the caller wasn't in a walled-off room 10 years in the past. He was in the crawl space 6 feet above my chair. I didn't call the police right away because I was paralyzed by the sight of a pale, thin finger slowly reaching through the gap in the vent. The finger was stained with old dust and something that looked like dried blood, tapping out the same rhythm on the metal grate. I stood up and backed away toward the front doors, but the electronic lock wouldn't engage, the power having been cut from somewhere inside the walls. I could hear him moving now, a series of wet, sliding sounds as he navigated the narrow ventilation shaft toward the lobby exit. I realized that the renovations 10 years ago hadn't just sealed off a room. They had provided a permanent, private world for someone who didn't want to be found. The calls weren't pleas for rescue. They were the sounds of a predator playing with his food before the sun came up. I spent the rest of my shift standing in the middle of the parking lot, staring up at the dark windows of the fourth floor. When my manager arrived at 7 a.m., he laughed at my story and told me I had just been spooked by the isolation of the night shift. He went up to the fourth floor with a maintenance man to check the wall, and they found absolutely nothing wrong with the wallpaper or the plaster. They didn't see the tiny, pin-sized holes I had noticed near the floorboards, or the way the floral pattern didn't quite line up at eye level. I quit on the spot, refusing to even go back inside to collect my personal belongings from the break room. I still live in the same town, and sometimes I drive past the St. Jude at night when the lobby lights are the only thing burning. Every time I do, I think about the new night clerk sitting at that beige console, waiting for the silence to be broken. I wonder if they've noticed the hum of the lights, or the way the ceiling tiles occasionally shift when there's no wind. Most of all, I wonder if the light for room 412 still blinks in the dead of night, signaling a guest who never checked out. There are no records of anyone being left behind during the renovation, but the blueprints don't lie about the square footage that went missing. The man in the walls knows exactly where the gaps are, and he knows that most people are too afraid to look behind the wallpaper. I keep my own house brightly lit now, and I've replaced all the drywall in my bedroom with solid wood paneling. You can't ever really be sure who is listening on the other end of a dead line, or what's crawling through the spaces you've forgotten to check. The St. Jude still stands, its halls filled with the living and the things that live between them, waiting for the phone to ring. I haven't answered a landline in 3 years, and I don't think I ever will again as long as I live. The sound of that wet breathing is still burned into my memory, a constant reminder that some doors are closed for a very good reason. If you ever stay at an old hotel and hear a tapping behind the headboard, don't assume it's the pipes. Just gather your things, walk out the front door, and don't look back at the walls, because once they know you can hear them, they never really stop calling your name. The silence of my own home feels heavy now, thick with the possibility of what might be hiding in the attic or the basement. I spend my nights watching the shadows, waiting for a light to blink that shouldn't be there. The world is full of walled-off places, and not all of them are empty. Sometimes, the most dangerous things are the ones we've spent a decade trying to ignore. I still have the old hotel's number saved in my phone, but I've blocked it, terrified that one day I'll see a missed call from a room that doesn't exist. There is no resolution to a story like this, only the lingering dread of knowing that the architecture of our lives is much thinner than we think. I hope the new clerk is faster than I was. I hope they don't pick up the phone when the light starts to flash. Most of all, I hope they don't look up at the vents when they hear that soft, bubbling laugh. The St. Jude is still there, and the man in the walls is still hungry for someone to listen to his secrets. The padding on my headset has started to flake off in little black specks that stick to my ears, but after 6 hours of sitting in this ergonomic chair, I barely even notice the itch anymore. The air in the dispatch center is always exactly 68 degrees to keep the servers from overheating, which means I spend most of my shift shivering under a thin fleece blanket that smells faintly of the break room's burnt coffee. It is 3 o'clock in the morning on a Tuesday, the deadest time of the week, when the only people awake are the drunks, the insomniacs, and the people who are about to have the worst night of their lives. My monitors are glowing with that sickly blue light that makes your eyes feel like they've been rubbed with sandpaper, and I'm staring at the CAD map, watching the little icons for the 3 active patrol cars crawl through the city streets like slow-moving beetles. Usually, the silence is a blessing because it means the city is sleeping peacefully. But tonight the quiet feels heavy and thick, pressing against the soundproof foam on the walls until my ears start to ring. I took this job because I wanted to help people, but most nights I just feel like a ghost, a disembodied voice floating in the ether of the local telecommunications grid, waiting for a tragedy to give me a reason to exist. I reached for my lukewarm coffee, wondering if I should walk down the hall to the vending machine for a shot of sugar, when the console in front of me chirped with a sharp, electronic trill that made me jump. I reflexively hit the foot pedal to open the line, sliding my professional mask back into place and adjusting the microphone an inch from my lips. 911, what is the location of your emergency? I said, my voice sounding flat and rehearsed in the hollow stillness of the room. There was no immediate answer, only a strange, rhythmic scratching sound that reminded me of a fingernail dragging slowly across a window screen. I leaned forward, squinting at the ANI/ALI display, which usually provides the caller's phone number and approximate location within a few seconds of the connection. The data fields flickered for a moment, the system struggling to narrow down the GPS coordinates from the cell tower, and then the text finally solidified into a crisp, bold font. My heart didn't just skip a beat. It felt like it stopped entirely and turned into a cold lump of lead in my chest when I read the address. 442 Whispering Pines Drive. That is my house. A small 2-bedroom bungalow on the edge of the woods that I've spent the last 3 years renovating with my own 2 hands. I felt a sudden, sharp spike of adrenaline that made my fingertips tingle and my vision go tunnel narrow, focusing entirely on that single line of text. Hello, this is 911, can you hear me? Is there someone at this address who needs help? I asked, my voice cracking slightly despite my years of training. The scratching stopped abruptly, and for a long, agonizing 10 seconds, there was nothing but the sound of heavy, wet breathing that sounded far too close to the receiver. It wasn't the frantic gasping of someone in a panic, but rather a slow, deliberate inhalation, like someone savoring the scent of a meal they were about to eat. I'm in the hallway. A voice finally whispered, and the breath went out of me because the voice sounded exactly like mine, but warped and distorted as if played through a broken speaker. I told myself it was a prank, that maybe one of the other dispatchers was playing a cruel joke, but I was the only one in the room tonight, and the security doors were all locked tight. I gripped the edge of the desk so hard my knuckles turned white, my mind racing through every possible explanation that didn't involve a person standing in my home. My husband, Mark, was supposed to be in Chicago for a business conference, leaving the house completely empty except for our golden retriever, Baxter. Who is this? If this is a prank, you are interfering with an emergency line and officers are already being dispatched to your location. I lied, my fingers hovering over the keyboard as I prepared to actually send the call to the patrol units. The voice on the other end gave a low, wet chuckle that made the hair on the back of my neck stand straight up, a primal instinct screaming at me to run even though there was nowhere to go. Baxter didn't like the noise, the voice said, and I heard a soft, rhythmic thudding in the background, the unmistakable sound of something heavy being dragged across the hardwood floors of my living room. I felt a wave of nausea roll over me as I pictured my dog, and I quickly pulled up my home security app on my personal phone, my hands shaking so much I almost dropped it. The app took forever to load, the little spinning circle mocking my desperation, while the caller continued to breathe into my ear. Finally, the feed for the living room camera popped up, but the screen was just a smear of grainy gray and black because someone had sprayed something over the lens. I switched to the bedroom camera, the one we keep on the dresser, and the night vision showed the room was empty, the bed neatly made just as I had left it that afternoon. But then I noticed the closet door, which I always keep shut because of the draft, was standing wide open, a dark rectangular maw in the corner of the frame. I like your pillows, the voice whispered through my headset, and on the screen I watched a pale, thin hand reach out from the shadows of the closet and gently stroke the fabric of my pillowcase. The fingers were unnaturally long, the skin looking like damp parchment stretched too tight over bone, and they moved with a jerky, twitching precision that wasn't quite human. I forgot about the protocols, forgot about the recorded lines, and I just started screaming at the person to get out of my house, my voice echoing off the empty desks around me. The hand on the screen paused, the fingers curling into the fabric, And then the person in the closet began to lean out, very slowly, until a sliver of a face was visible in the infrared light. They weren't wearing a mask. Their features were just wrong, as if someone had tried to draw a human face from memory and got the proportions slightly off. The eyes were too wide and set too deep in the skull, and they were staring directly at the camera, as if they knew I was watching from miles away. "You're late tonight, Sarah," the voice said, no longer whispering but speaking in a clear, resonant tone that vibrated in my earpieces. I realized then, with a jolt of pure horror, that the caller wasn't using a cell phone or the landline. The dispatch system was showing the call coming from the integrated smart home hub I'd installed in the kitchen. He was standing in my bedroom, but he was talking to me through the speaker system I used to play music while I cooked dinner. I frantically hit the keys to dispatch the closest unit, a Code 3 response, telling the officers there was an armed intruder in my residence and that I was the homeowner. My coworkers in the field responded immediately, their voices crackling over the radio with a professional urgency that usually calmed me. But now, it felt like they were a lifetime away. "Units are 3 minutes out, Sarah. Just stay on the line with me," I whispered to myself, realized I was talking to the intruder as if I were helping a victim. The man on the screen didn't move. He just kept staring at the camera, a thin, crooked smile spreading across his face to reveal teeth that looked like jagged shards of yellowed ivory. He reached up with his other hand and began to unbutton his shirt, his movements slow and deliberate, and I realized he was wearing one of Mark's flannel shirts. It was the blue one with the tear in the sleeve that I'd been meaning to fix for months, and seeing it on this stranger felt like a physical violation, a knife twisting in my gut. "Mark won't be home until tomorrow, but I thought I'd get the place ready for you," he said, and then he reached out and snapped the camera off the dresser. The feed on my phone went static, leaving me with only the audio on my headset and the cold, oppressive silence of the dispatch center. I could hear him walking now, the floorboards groaning under his weight as he moved toward the kitchen, the sound of his footsteps echoing strangely. I looked at the CAD map and saw the patrol car was only 2 blocks away, their sirens likely wailing through the quiet neighborhood, waking up the neighbors. "They're almost there," I said, my voice trembling with a mixture of terror and a desperate hope for vengeance. "The police are turning onto the street right now, and they are going to find you." The caller didn't seem bothered. In fact, he sounded almost disappointed, a soft sigh escaping his lips that sent a chill down my spine. "They won't find me in the house, Sarah, because I'm not in the house anymore," he said, and the sound of his voice changed, losing that hollow, echoed quality of the smart hub speaker. The audio on my headset suddenly became crystal clear, the background noise shifting from the silence of my home to the low, humming thrum of heavy-duty air conditioners and server fans. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard it hurt, as I realized the background noise on the 911 call now matched the exact ambient frequency of the room I was sitting in. I slowly turned my chair around, my eyes scanning the rows of empty desks and the dark corners where the shadows seemed to pool like spilled ink. The dispatch center is a fortress, requiring 2 separate keycard scans and a biometric thumbprint to enter, and I had been alone in here for hours. I looked at the glass partition that separated my console from the supervisor's empty office, and in the reflection of my monitors, I saw a movement in the heavy velvet curtains draped over the back windows. The curtains were there to block the morning sun, but now they were swaying gently, as if someone had just brushed past them. My breath hitched in my throat when I saw a pale, thin hand reach out from between the fabric folds, the fingers long and twitching, just like the ones I had seen on the bedroom camera. He hadn't been calling from my house. He had routed the call through my home network to make me think he was there, while he was actually standing 10 feet behind me. I realized then that the thudding sound I'd heard wasn't him dragging something in my living room. It was the sound of the heavy security door latching shut behind him as he slipped into the room. He had used my own house as a diversion, knowing I would be distracted by the cameras and the address on the screen, blinded by my own fear for my home. I tried to stand up, to run for the emergency exit, but my legs felt like water and the cord of my headset was tangled around the armrest of my chair, tethering me to the desk. I heard a soft click as he turned off the light switch at the back of the room, plunging the far end of the center into total darkness. The only light left was the blue glow from my monitors, casting long, distorted shadows across the floor that seemed to reach for me like grasping arms. I reached for the radio to scream for help, to tell the officers that the threat was here with me. But the caller spoke one last time into my ear. "Don't bother," he whispered, and I felt the warmth of his breath on the back of my neck, smelling of copper and old, dry earth. I already turned the radio off. I looked down and saw the transmit light was dark, the cable having been silently unplugged from the back of the console while I was watching the static on my phone. The patrol cars were at my house, miles away, kicking in my front door and searching empty rooms while I was trapped in a soundproof bunker with a man who had my voice. I didn't scream because I knew no one would hear me through the reinforced concrete walls and the triple-paned glass. I just sat there in the blue light, listening to the sound of him stepping out from behind the curtain, his footsteps silent on the industrial carpet. He didn't rush. He took his time, savoring the final moments of the hunt, while the sirens of my coworkers faded into the distance on the CAD map. The last thing I heard before the headset was ripped from my head was the sound of my own voice, coming from his throat, whispering that everything was going to be okay. The police found the dispatch center empty the next morning, the monitors still glowing blue and my headset lying on the floor, the foam earpiece torn to shreds. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood, and the security footage from the hallway showed only me entering the building at the start of my shift. They found my car in the parking lot and my house in perfect order, with Buster sleeping soundly on the rug as if nothing had ever happened. But sometimes, when the new night shift dispatcher picks up a silent call, they say they can hear a rhythmic scratching sound and the faint, distorted voice of a woman whispering an address that doesn't exist. They never find where the calls come from, and the GPS coordinates always point to the empty chair in the corner of the room. I'm still out there somewhere, or at least the part of me that remembers how to scream is, waiting for the next person to pick up the line. But for now, the city is quiet, the blue lights are dim, and the scratching is getting louder again.